The United Nations was founded on seemingly noble principles, promoting peace, protecting human rights, and fostering global connection. But if you do some digging, and I mean literally just some, just go just beneath the surface, you'll find a lot of corruption, inefficiency, and power imbalances that perhaps distract from all of those set goals. Has this organization lived up to its promises, or is it in need of some sort of desperate change? To better understand, we need to take it back, all the way back. The United Nations was formed on October 24th, 1945, in the aftermath of World War II. Its primary mission was to prevent future global conflicts and to create a platform for dialogue. The Charter of the United Nations lays out four main purposes: to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations amongst nations based on respect for equal rights and self-determination of peoples, to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems, and to be the center for harmonizing the actions in the attainment of these common ends. These are very noble aims at the surface, but the only problem is that each one of these aims requires funding. And not to signal the UN out, any non-profit organization or any organization in general requires money to operate. The United Nations funding comes from two main sources: assessed contributions and voluntary contributions. Assessed contributions are mandatory payments made by member states to fund the core functions of the UN, such as the General Assembly, the Secretariat, and peacekeeping operations. The amount each country pays is calculated based on its gross national income and adjusted for factors like debt burden. The United States, for example, is the largest contributor, providing about 22% of the regular budget and 25% of the peacekeeping budget as of recent years. In 2022, the UN's regular budget was approximately $3.1 billion, while the peacekeeping budget was around $6.5 billion. The second type of contributions are voluntary contributions. These funds specialize agencies and humanitarian programs such as UNICEF, the World Food Program, and the UN Development Program. And here, contributions can be made by countries, private sector partners, and even individuals. These voluntary contributions are crucial, and in 2021 alone, the voluntary contributions reached a record $53.2 billion. And this is where the first problem comes in. The UN's reliance on funding from wealthy countries like the United States, China, Japan, and Germany gives these nations disproportionate influence over the organization's priorities and decision making. The United States of America, for example, has historically used its financial leverage to shape UN policies, even threatening to withhold funding over certain highly politicized issues. Former President and President-elect Donald Trump, for instance, pulled funding from several UN agencies such as the WHO, citing inefficiencies and alleged favoritism towards China. And the second problem is, even though rich countries might influence certain policies, there's an overall theme of financial mismanagement and lack of accountability. The UN has faced repeated accusations of financial mismanagement, waste, and a lack of transparency. And this is not just me saying it, there's been several instances, one of the biggest ones being the oil for food scandal that started in 1995. This was one of the largest scandals in UN history. The program was designed to allow Iraq to sell oil in exchange for humanitarian aid, while still under international sanctions. This program became riddled with corruption. An independent investigation led by Paul Volcker found that over $1.8 billion was siphoned off by Saddam Hussein's regime through kickbacks and surcharges. UN officials and several multinational companies were implicated in this scandal. And not just humanitarian efforts, we also have to look at peacekeeping operations. Peacekeeping operations are crucial to the UN's charter, but have been criticized for poor financial oversight. There's been several instances of contractors inflating prices, misappropriation of funds, and lack of transparency. A famous example is in the DRC, or the Democratic Republic of Congo. Investigations revealed that tens of millions of dollars were misspent on overpriced or unnecessary goods. For instance, contracts for vehicle maintenance were awarded to companies with political connections instead of technical expertise. In fact, according to the UN Board of Auditors, in 2020, $19 million worth of peacekeeping expenditures were flagged for potential mismanagement. And perhaps the biggest issue when it comes to financial management is wasteful spending in administrative costs. Before we dig deeper, if you are enjoying this video, please smash the like button and the subscribe button. Every subscriber helps get this video to the right people interested in learning more about things that affect us daily from a financial or business perspective. The UN's vast bureaucracy leads to high admin expenses, diverting resources from crucial programs. A 2012 report revealed that the UN spends nearly $1 billion annually on travel expenses, with officials often flying first class or staying in luxury hotels. The WHO alone spent $200 million on travel in 2017, more than what it spent on tackling major public health issues like AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. A 2019 report by the UN Office of Internal Oversight Services found instances where funds meant for humanitarian relief in South Sudan were misused. with a portion being spent on unnecessary goods and services, including, wait for it, luxury SUVs. And these problems are not helped by nepotism and favoritism that is rampant across the UN. A 2020 report by the Transparency International watchdog indicated that nepotism remains a persistent problem in the UN, with positions often going to candidates with political or personal connections. These positions range all the way from internships to high senior leadership positions. And here we really need to analyze what this nepotism and favoritism does to the already existing bureaucracy and efficiency. The United Nations is already known for its complex and extensive bureaucracy, which consists of numerous agencies, commissions, and departments. This vast structure, while designed to handle a variety of global issues, often results in layers of red tape that delay or completely obstruct effective action. The first part of this is the organizational complexity. The UN system is made up of main organs such as the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the Secretariat. But there's also specialized agencies like the WHO, the International Labour Organization, and numerous sub-agencies. Each agency operates semi-independently and has its own rules and budgets, which can lead to duplication of efforts, competition for funding, and a lack of cohesive strategy. A long-winded way of saying that this leads to slow decision-making. The decision-making process is cumbersome and often requires consensus or approval from multiple bodies. This can lead to prolonged debates, particularly when geopolitical interests clash. One of the biggest players in this is the Security Council. It's often deadlocked because of the veto power held by its 5 permanent members: the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom. Since 1945, over 200 vetoes have been used, often preventing timely resolutions in response to crises. And these delays can lead to gruesome consequences. One of the most damning examples of UN inefficiency occurred during the Rwandan genocide, when nearly 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were massacred over a period of 100 days. Despite warnings from UN peacekeepers on the ground, the Security Council failed to act decisively. The UN assistance mission for Rwanda was understaffed and restricted from using force to prevent violence. When the genocide began, the Security Council reduced the peacekeeping force from 2,500 to just 270 troops, despite knowing the severity of the situation. By the time international forces were deployed, it was already too late to save hundreds of thousands of lives. We don't have to look that long ago. We can also go with a modern example. For example, the Darfur crisis. The conflict in Darfur, Sudan has led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and the displacement of millions. Despite acknowledging the situation in 2004, the UN took years to deploy a joint peacekeeping mission with the African Union. The deployment was delayed by bureaucratic negotiations and a lack of consensus amongst member states. It took until 2007 for the mission to be operational, by which time the crisis had escalated significantly. So in fact, it's been extremely inefficient at dealing with large-scale crises. But it doesn't stop there. The high administrative costs consume a significant portion of its budget. Critics argue that too much funding is directed towards salaries, travel expenses, and bureaucratic functions instead of programs that directly aid those in need. Here you might say, well, every organization has admin costs and this is not unique to the UN. But the problem is that a 2012 report by Reuters found that approximately 38% of the UN's budget was spent on admin costs, far more than comparable organizations. For instance, the World Bank spends only 11% on admin costs. So in fact, the UN is spending 3 times what a normal non-profit or charity organization spends. This red tape has led to some very severe consequences, particularly in Haiti. Following the 2010 earthquake, the UN's response was criticized for being slow and ineffective. Despite pledging billions of dollars in aid, processes delayed the delivery of critical resources, and many Haitians remained in makeshift camps for years. And to cap all of this off, there's just no accountability, really, when it comes to the United Nations. UN officials are often shielded from scrutiny, and there's no central mechanism to hold senior leaders accountable for failures. When operations falter, blame is diffused across multiple entities, making meaningful reform difficult. If there's 4 entities involved in a peacekeeping mission or a humanitarian aid mission, it is hard to pinpoint which official or which set of officials led to more bureaucracy or the least optimal outcome. And this intergovernmental nature means that powerful member states often prioritize national interests over global well-being, which further complicates decision-making and action. A famous example is climate change negotiations often stalling because industrialized nations that have already exploited the climate often have conflicting interests from developing countries that have more economically motivated policymaking. And many people want to go at the root of this problem of slow decision-making. The United United Nations Security Council. It's one of the most powerful bodies in the UN and, in fact, the world. It has the authority to impose sanctions, authorize military interventions, and deploy peacekeeping forces. It's composed of 15 members, 5 permanent members that we already talked about, the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom, and 10 non-permanent members elected for 2-year terms. The 5 permanent members, or the P5 as they're called, can block resolutions even if the resolution has majority support among the other members. This was established to prevent the Council from acting against the major powers' core interests. This veto power is extremely controversial and has been scrutinized. It's an obstacle when it comes to effective decision making and has often been used by the P5 for geopolitical interests. For example, Russia has used its veto over 120 times, often to protect its interests in conflicts. The United Nations has used its veto more than 80 times. A stark example of how this can paralyze the UN is the Syrian civil war, which began in 2011. Despite overwhelming evidence of human rights violations and the use of weapons against civilians, multiple resolutions aimed at sanctioning the regime were vetoed by P5 members. The UN estimates that the war has resulted in over 500,000 deaths and the displacement of millions. And not just China and Russia, the US has used its financial leverage many times. It is the largest contributor to the UN budget and is pulled out of several UN agencies and slashed funding to programs it disagrees with. This ultimately leads to selective intervention. The UN has been criticized for selectively intervening in crises. While some conflicts receive significant attention and resources, others are largely ignored due to a lack of strategic interest from the P5. For example, the crisis in Yemen directly doesn't affect the P5 and doesn't receive much attention in the UN Security Council. We've only criticized the UN for now, and it may seem like it's never done anything good, but that is not the point of this video. The WHO, for example, has been pivotal in fighting infectious diseases. Malaria programs in Africa have also been successful. And the World Food Program has been a lifeline for millions of people affected by war, famine, and natural disasters. In fact, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2020, feeding over 100 million people. But even though there is this element of success, the argument is that this could be tenfold or even 20-fold or more than that if it wasn't for mismanagement and wasteful spending. We've talked about Haiti before, and I'll bring it up again. Following the devastating 2010 earthquake, the UN raised over $13 billion in aid pledges. But a report from The Guardian in 2015 revealed that only 1% of this $13 billion had gone directly to the Haitian government, and most of the money channeled through UN agencies and NGOs never got to the government or to the people that were actually suffering from the earthquake. The Associated Press in 2012 had something similar to say, saying that UN peacekeeping missions had accumulated nearly $1 billion in unspent funds over a 5-year period, funds that could have been used for pressing humanitarian needs. Even if you ignore this entire monetary aspect, sometimes these interventions also have unintended negative consequences. For example, in 2010, Nepalese peacekeepers stationed in Haiti inadvertently introduced cholera into the country, leading to an outbreak that affected over 800,000 people. The UN initially denied responsibility, only acknowledging its role in 2016 after years of public outcry and mounting evidence. And sometimes UN peacekeepers are also not vetted before being stationed. In 2018, an Associated Press investigation found that nearly 2,000 allegations of abuse by UN peacekeepers and staff occurred between 2004 and 2016. Only a fraction of those accused faced any legal consequences. How do you improve all of this? How do you make sure that the UN operates more efficiently and the right people get access to the right resources? Proposals for reform have been common, and there's been numerous throughout the decades. The number one focus is Security Council reform. The current structure, dominated by the permanent 5 members or the P5, has been criticized for being undemocratic and unrepresentative of the modern geopolitical landscape. One of the most proposed changes is expansion of membership, expanding the number of permanent and non-permanent members to better reflect the global power dynamics. Countries like India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan have lobbied for permanent seats, arguing that the current structure is outdated. Another possibility is limiting or abolishing veto power. Some suggest that a resolution could require a supermajority instead of being subject to the whims of one country. As of 2024, more than 80 member states have expressed support for expanding the Security Council, but the reality remains that any change to the Security Council requires the consent of the entire P5, who are unlikely to give up their privileges and veto power, particularly because of geopolitical rivalries between the US, China, Russia, and other nations. Even if we disregard making changes to the Security Council, there's also the element of accountability and transparency. There's been a proposal to establish an independent watchdog body to audit audit the UN's finances and investigate allegations of corruption. This could be modeled after national anti-corruption agencies, but with a global mandate. But the fact remains that there is already something that exists for this, the UN Office of Internal Oversight Services. But many believe that these organizations lack authority and independence needed to hold powerful UN officials accountable. And when 40% of your budget is spent on admin costs, it signals a huge bureaucracy that takes decades to fix, not just a couple of years. The third area, and perhaps a more realistic one, has been peacekeeper accountability. There's been many attempts to reform the system, including implementing stricter vetting processes, providing better training on human rights, and ensuring that allegations of misconduct are thoroughly investigated. One of the ways the UN is looking to address this is through digital transformation, leveraging technology to streamline processes, improve communication, reduce admin costs, and increase security internally. But the challenge with that is that this once again requires money. Many of the proposed reforms, including modernizing infrastructure, require substantial investment, once again increasing reliance on richer nations. So the reforms are there, and there's been some interest in implementing these to make this organization more efficient. But given the challenges, there's actually been another debate. Is the UN still necessary? There's been an argument for a new approach, a UN 2.0 model, which would involve dismantling the current structure and rebuilding a more agile and transparent organization. Maybe even creating regional organizations that have more authority and prioritize accountability and effectiveness in their own regions, reducing or rather limiting the bureaucracy that exists in the UN. And because of the UN being so bloated, it's been very slow in response to challenges such as cyber warfare, artificial intelligence governance, and anything tech related basically. Addressing these issues will require innovation and willingness to embrace change. I guess the positive is that most people want the UN to change. In fact, a 2024 survey by the World Economic Forum found that 63% of respondents believe that the UN must undergo significant reforms to remain relevant in the coming decades. On the flip side though, only 27% were optimistic that meaningful reforms would be implemented. The fact remains that the United Nations stands at a crossroads. While there is no doubt that it played a significant role in fostering global connection, its effectiveness is undermined by structural inefficiencies and a lack of accountability. Proposals are numerous, but their feasibility remains a challenge, as we've seen. The question remains, can the UN transform itself to meet the requirements of a rapidly changing world? Or is it time to consider a new model for global governance? I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next one.